The following video is part of a larger lecture hosted in the portal with Michel Bauwens for a course dedicated to the commons, peer-to-peer, and civilizational transition. To see the full video, you can sign up using the link below to get lifetime access to the commons course. You can also get access to the video by becoming a member of the portal. Members of the portal are the core of Philosophy Portal and get access to our entire recorded history. We also host 4 live events every month. To learn more or to sign up, check the link below, and I hope to see you at a future event. Welcome to the portal. Welcome to a new month in the portal. And we're here with Michel Bauwens. Michel, I'll give you the opportunity here just to introduce yourself and your background for anyone who doesn't know you, for anyone who's not familiar with your work. Welcome to the portal.
All right. Well, I see some names that I'm familiar with, so I won't name you, but happy to see you there. Yeah, maybe I should say a word of where I am, because it's not my usual place. So I live in Chiang Mai, northern Thailand, which is a really lovely place. And it's kind of a subterfuge, some because you can place it different, but if you put a 2,000 miles or 2,000 kilometer line around Chiang Mai, you have 60% of the world population. So it's, it's India, China, Indonesia, the Philippines. It's all around us. And it's a lovely place. But I'm originally from Belgium. Whether that matters or not, I'm a father of 4 children. And that's a big part of my life. Yeah, I think, what drove me in the beginning of my life is really unhappiness. Is it William James who talks about the agnostic condition? You're in this world, but not of this world. Some people are happy, lucky to live in the right time, right village, right family. And some people say, what's wrong with the operating system? Something doesn't fit. And so people like me, we struggle a lot to make sense of life. And in the varieties of religious experience, when William James talks about firstborn and secondborn, it really says that these kind of people, because we can't find meaning easily, we have to go to many places. And then sometimes something happens, which Eric Neumann calls centroversion. So the first half of your life, you try to adapt and deal with your inheritance. And the second part of your life, you try to adapt the world to yourself. And so these kind of people, generally speaking, are often or sometimes, leaders of Reformation movements, political movements. And his book is basically about the founders of the Reformed churches. But anyway, so lived 40 years in Belgium, had a pretty classic business career. First worked for United States Information Agency for 9 years as an analyst and librarian. Worked 3 years doing strategic business information for the top of BP, agribusiness, which is a bit surprising because nobody knows they were an agribusiness, but they had 25,000 people working on animal feed. I created 2 startups in the 90s, internet startups. Some people say I trained the first generation of internet entrepreneurs, and that might be true. I was very active in the beginning of the 90s, trying to convince people that this was going to change the world. And my last job was for Belgacom, the largest telco, where I was director of digital strategy. And by that time, I was completely disgusted with the business world and where it was going. I took a 2-year sabbatical, studied the transitions from one civilization to another. And we can come back to that topic. And out of that came a certain conviction, which then led to the P2P Foundation in 2005. So, and then...
and for those who don't know, could you explain what the Peer-to-Peer Foundation is and how they can explore the wiki that you've set up and other
Right.
aspects of it.
Yeah, so basically as a former Marxist, because if you would look at my spiritual life, I had a first period where as a Marxist for 7-8 years when I was young, and then I decided that the world wasn't changing in the way I wanted, and that if I couldn't change the world and I was unhappy, then I had to change myself. So then I started 7 years of therapy, 7 years of spiritual search. And I gave up on my militancy and my activism, but somehow there was also something like that that was depressing me in some fundamental ways, because I wasn't accepting of the world as it was. And so it was kind of out despair. And then at some point in my life, I was in the mid-90s, I had a very profound crisis, and I took back this activism. I said, this is what I have to do in this planet. Whether it will work or not, I don't care anymore, but this is what I have to do. And so when I took my 2 year sabbatical, it was really, the question for me was, how do societies change? And my conclusion was that there's the essential is not a revolution which comes after a long process, but the essential thing to look at are the seed forms. And the seed forms are what happen when the old system is disintegrating, the legitimacy of the institutions is going down, and then you have two waves of exit. And the first waves of exit, in my view, is the pioneering, I call it people with anticipatory consciousness. And they're the ones setting up, trying out the new logics, new types of solutions that don't fit the old paradigm. And so you have a period of like Darwinian selection of these seed forms, which eventually consolidate in subsystems. And then eventually it's taken up by some, what I call jurisdictional alliance, a successful jurisdictional alliance that pushes this new logic as the main logic of the new society or civilization. So this idea of seed forms for me had a double coloring today, which was peer-to-peer and the commons. And I'll come back to that in the third session, but just to briefly announce it. So peer-to-peer for me is trans-local self-organization. A capacity that existed before because we had transport and communication, but which became at a much higher level of capacity through the internet, which creates a many-to-many synchronous and asynchronous capacity to self-organize relatively independently of geography. And so if you look at the balance between territorial and non-territorial, between the nations and the cosmopolis, well, we have a particular period where the cosmopolis has achieved much stronger capacities. So peer-to-peer is that capacity of organization, and the commons was the main feature of what this wave was doing. So the main aspect of peer-to-peer, of digital peer-to-peer capacity, was the creation of shared knowledge, shared software, and shared design commons. And that brought back the commons in Western consciousness, where it had, I mean, a few Marxists were talking about it, a few historians about the commons and the enclosures, but it was absolutely not a part of average consciousness that the commons was a thing. And this was massively brought back in 93 with the democratization of the browser and the web, and then was accelerating in 2008, where according in different countries in Europe, from 30 to 50% of young people were unemployed, and they massively turned to self-organizing their lives using these new network technologies. And in some way, the sharing became what I sometimes use the word phygital. So this kind of emergence of a convergence between the digital and the physical, using peer-to-peer and commons as the main paradigms. That was something that I thought I was seeing, and which I make the hypothesis that this was the seed form of the next civilization. And
So,
so, yeah.
yeah. So if this seed form, of course, 2008, we had the financial collapse. I'm sure that's somehow linked. I'd be interested to know how you think that's linked. But if there's the seed form at the origin of the internet in the 90s and then 2008, have you seen any interesting plants grow? Are we in a plant growth phase, or are we still in seed form phase in a way?
Um, yeah, that's really hard to say. I mean, so I think the problem that we're living through is that the disintegration of the old system is going much faster than the capacity of
Yeah.
the alternative world to, to offer a full alternative. But definitely, if you look at the speed of change. So when I did a survey for the city of Ghent in 2016 or 2017, so we mapped out the urban commons in the city of Ghent in 2008 and then in 2016, and there was a tenfold increase, so from 50 to 500 in 10 years. Then I verified these figures on the Flanders, Belgium, Catalonia, Europe, the Netherlands, and the same figures came up. So this is definitely a thing. And then just to mention a figure I saw about 2 weeks ago is that there were 150 eco villages in France in 10 years ago, and they're now 1,500. So, to say that
Right.
nothing is happening, that would be wrong. But also, for example, were there like 18 million free software developers just in India? I mean, if that's not significant, I think it is. And like 18 million people have crypto wallets in Vietnam. So you can find a lot of figures that show that though it hasn't taken power yet, that it is it's something that is growing within the womb of the old. And we could say that actually capital today, in my view, is a commons-based capital already, right? So you look at this debate in the 19th century between Marx and Proudhon about the source of value, where Marx would say is the surplus of labor, and Proudhon would say no, it's cooperation, right? You put 100 craftsmen together, they will be much more productive than if they work separately. That was the argument of Proudhon. So he said, actually, what he said was, it's that commoning that creates the value. Now, if you look at all the big companies today that making, with huge valuations, who are they? They are Proudhonian capitalist companies. They have already learned how to exploit the commons, and that's basically the point of Yanis Varoufakis when he talks about techno-feudalism, is that he says the new capital is a rent-seeking capital that is creating profit on the basis of letting us exchange and share over commons or pseudo-commons platforms. So I would argue that in that sense, and I think that is normal. That was one of my arguments from the very beginning, is that to especially people on the left say, well, it's already recuperated. And my argument has always been it has to be recuperated before it can change. Because the old system is also funding those tools that are also undermining it.
Let's get into it. We're going to start with Spengler, and I guess one of the things that I'm going to be thinking about, I want to think with you throughout tonight's conversation, is the macro historical patterns and what they can tell us in the context of global capitalism and global civilization, which is, I think you would agree, qualitatively different, qualitatively unique, historically speaking. And then how do those patterns interact with our situation, our condition, and perhaps just the expansive overview we're going to be going into, because you're not just going into one or even one subset of macro historians. We're going to be covering so many different approaches to macro history. So right there, you get an overview of the cultural approaches
Yeah,
and the three thinkers there, Spengler, Toynbee, and Quigley. The question I want to frame to you for this, Michel, is
yeah,
that Spengler seems like such an outsized figure, like such a figure of
yeah.
great importance in the way you're framing macro history. I guess my question would be, why is Spengler so crucial? Why do we need to engage with Spengler's work? And why was there such a reaction towards Spengler?
Yeah, so I have to say I have the same reaction to Spengler, which was not expected. But this is when you read the book, The Decline of the West, it doesn't leave you. It's like it just stays there. It's if you want to fight it, but it's there.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think paradoxically, and this is maybe hard to believe to some people, but in a way, Spengler anticipated postmodernism. And he was also maybe not the first, but the circumstances of saying that the West is finished. But you have to see World War One was devastating, right? You had this European optimism, which you can read in Stefan Zweig, The World of Yesterday, which is an amazing book. And then like this total destruction and this tens of millions of people die um, and so for Spengler to say that the West is finished, first of all, in that time frame in Germany in the 20s, where they lived through the defeat, but also because the wider European culture was becoming aware of its faults. So that was a good period, and you can see like Spengler, they stopped talking about him in the 50s. When the optimism comes back, the attention to Spengler becomes less. But let me briefly explain his main ideas. So the first idea is that
Like a very organismic view.
exactly, yeah. So a civilization is born, matures, ages, and dies. So that's a very important point, and he gives it 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So, for example, what I found interesting, learning about Europe, is that he views the birth of Europe in 997, 998, when the is it Otto II maybe in Germany and the first Capetian, kind of start with the conversions of the Germanic and the Roman, like a kind of the mix is taking place. And so those first 200 to 300 years, which is the high Middle Ages from 1050 to the catastrophic 14th century, that's like the birth of Europe, not the 500 years between 500 and 1000, right? So you can do that for every civilization. There's a date, and there's 1,000 years. No, then people will say, well, what about China? It's 3,000 years old, and what about Egypt? It lasted so long.
Right.
And his answer would be, those are like repetitive forms. They do no longer bring that much new. So that first phase of civilization is like where everything happens. And he gives a kind of a synthetic view of how this happens. So for him, civilization only emerges when you have two peoples coming together, a original population, likely settled population, and an invading population. So once you have that, customs are no longer operative. You can't have customs and the gift economy, and all the high trust elements of a kinship-based society when you have that domination. Now these two peoples have to learn to live together. So, and he will say there will always be two classes, the warriors and the priests. He doesn't talk about the commoners. He doesn't have a high view of the commoners. So for him, the warriors and the priests, And basically, the priests are there to civilize the warriors. You know, you can rape and pillage outside, but when you come home, you have to respect your own people. So if that works, if that mixture works, then you get the cities. And in the cities, you have a third estate.
Yeah.
Eventually, that third estate will make a coalition with the monarchs and will eliminate the caste system.
Which for people who don't know, the third estate's basically the workers.
Yeah, the bourgeois, the merchant class, the patricians, whatever you want to call them, who live in the city and control the wealth of the city. So that they will ally with the monarchs and eliminate the caste system. Then the next step is the megalopolis. As that happens, and by the way, this is the end of 500 years. What you have at the end of 500 years is the end of the dynamic period of a civilization, which they call culture. Right? So the first 500 years are the culture years, and they're decentralized. By the time at the end of the 500 years, these cities start fighting each other. So there is a civilizational area, but it's not an empire. So think about the polis in Greece and how, at some point all these cities start fighting each other and exhaust each other. And then Macedonia falls in, and then Rome. So that's when culture becomes empire. And when you have empire, you have the big cities, and you have the merchants, the engineers, and the military. And what they do is kind of mechanizing the civilization and then exporting it as an empire. So that would be the two last periods. And just to finish the logic, which is then the proletariat emerges in this megalopolis, and that's the end, right? So for him, that's an element of corruption, because democracy, so you need democracy to pacify the proletarians, but democracy is corrupted by money and always ends up badly. And then you have the age of the Caesars.
So this is the cycle.
This is the cycle.
So I just want to emphasize that what make clear, because I think this is important, is the seasonal view versus the chronological view. I think that certainly I have a disposition towards the chronological view, seeing things in terms of ancient and modern. Sometimes
he rejects that. He completely rejects that.
Right.
So he was the first one to say there is no such thing as antiquity
and
modernity.
Yeah.
But here's where it becomes interesting, right? So whether you agree with this or not is not the point, I think. But the point is that allows you to do comparative history, not at the
chronologically,
but like ontologically. So what can you compare the end of the Han and the end of Rome? Right? Which, by the way, was more or less at the same time.
Right.
But it doesn't have to, because other civilizations had different chronologies. So you have to look at, for example, he would say that Stoicism, Christianity, Epicureanism are end stage ideologies, just as socialism, right? Because so what he would argue is Stoicism is stay calm in the storm, right? You don't really believe in positive change anymore. Epicureanism is, go out to the countryside with your friends, create gardens, and cultivate friendship. It's not exactly either a kind of engaged stance towards civilization. And then Christianity says this world is without hope. We have to focus on the other world. So for him, this would be like typically end stage ideologies. And he would then argue that, socialism would be like a similar thing in the modern time. Again, it's not about agreeing with what he's saying, but I think it's very fruitful to do that, to compare, potential end times, middle, and that will give you like a very different view. So then the second thing maybe to say is the prime symbol. I think that can be fruitful as well. So prime symbol is that every civilization has its own peculiar choice about how to what they are about.
Right.
And so, for example, he would,
Like America would be life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, something like that.
yeah, yeah. Although, for him, this is already the declining Western civilization, right?
Right.
It's not a separate civilization for Spengler. But he would say, for example, the Greeks, it's a body in space. That's their prime symbol. And so their mathematics will be about bodies moving in space. Their temples will have bodies, beautiful bodies, and their view is only the polis. What you can see from the top of your city, that's your world. Now, the European is completely different. It's when Europe is born, it's the spires of the Gothic cathedral, and he says that's the merger of the Germans looking at the sky to the infinity of the sky, and so Europe is Faustian. That's the way Faustian, which is basically the search for the infinite.
This
Always looking for
inspired by Goethe.
yeah. And then he talks about the Magian, which is basically the Middle East, and then he would have arguments like, well, both the mosques and the Byzantine churches are cupolas, including like 4th, 5th century Rome, because that was completely dominated by Syrian and Iraqi architects by that time, right? And so he says that their worldview is we're protected by the 7 spheres, and there are no big windows. So and then he would argue about the Buddha always has his eyes closed, so it's the inner path. Okay, again, we can argue with it, but I think it's fruitful to think like that. Like, is there some essence? So where it becomes where it gets a lot of critique, and I would agree with that critique, is he says civilizations don't learn from each other at all.
Right. We
So
don't learn from history.
Yeah, you don't learn from history, but you also don't learn from each other, because you can only interpret reality.
Is it because you're so focused on your prime symbol?
Yeah, exactly. So we have these frames that completely, and so kind of his idea is that civilization is how you deal with trauma, right?
Yeah. Okay, so civilization is a reaction to trauma on a collective level?
Yeah, so indigenous people live in kinship, small convivial communities. They know each other. They might go to war, but they go to war with people that they know and love. In civilization, you're dominated, you're exploited, you live in big cities with neighbors that you don't know. And so basically suffering needs to be explained. And so civilization is an answer. Like the religion that founds a civilization is what gives meaning to the suffering. It's like a heroic answer to the tragedy of civilization. Okay, it's maybe tautological, but that's kind of the way he sees it.
Before moving on, we're gonna have more perhaps serious responses to Spengler, maybe more fundamental. But how do you understand Toynbee and Quigley as in this mix?
Yeah, so if Spengler is a product of Germany and the feet of Germany, Toynbee is a product of the English, elite in a way. Even though he was poor, and he got bursaries and stuff, but he was an extremely good student. But so compared to Spengler, Toynbee represents a different cultural background, right? Living in the 40s and 50s, and he critiques Spengler on that statism, on that static thinking. And so it's hard to summarize Toynbee, but he has what is fascinating about reading Toynbee is that dynamic vision of history. So his basic idea is challenge and response. So for him, a civilization is always a reaction to a challenge. And he actually makes the argument that if there's no challenge, there's no civilization. So he takes the example of Campania, I think, the province next to Rome. And have you ever heard about it? No, because
No.
nature is too pleasant there. But the
Yeah.
Romans had to fight with marches and with mosquitoes, and they had to, so and Egypt had to contend with flooding. So for him, civilization is a reaction, challenge and response. It's also about creative minorities. So it's always started by a group of people like Alexander, and his mates, and the rest of society follows through mimetism. But it's
there's a minority of creative originality, and then the rest
exactly.
is kind of mimesis and imitation.
Exactly, and they will kind of impose their view, and that will create a civilization. But over time, they become corrupted, and then they become a dominant minority, right? So in the beginning, they have the legitimacy of innovation and dynamism, and people follow them willingly. But as they get degenerated and corrupted, there is more and more resistance, and then they become authoritarian. But that's a sign of the end. And then he has a particular interesting interpretation of the change between. So he has 3 levels of civilization: the pre-eggshell, the eggshell, and the modern. So that's different from Spengler, right? Spengler, there is no evolution of civilization. It's always the same organism in different regions, different time periods, but they don't learn from each other, they don't communicate with each other. Spengler is, no, there's a first level of civilization, there's a second level, and there's a third level. And what is interesting...
Toynbee.
Toynbee, yes, sorry.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, for example, is what the dynamism, the relationship between the proletariat and the universal church in creating the new civilizations. So typically, the proletariat for him are all the people who are alienated in a civilization. So the slaves, for example, in Roman times, right? Up to 25% of the population, sometimes even more. So these are people who are alienated. They're not happy. They've been taken out of their own countries. They sleep in huge barracks, can't have families. Like, these are not happy people. And then also the farmers get chased away, because now it's cheaper to have latifundias with slaves than to have small farmers. The small farmers go to the city where they get bread and games, but they're not happy either. Because they're basically on the welfare rolls. So these people, and this, I'm anticipating the pulsation of the commons here, but so there are periods when this Mark and the state do well, and that keeps the proletariat in its place and is satisfied enough. But when Marx and the states go down, when the empire goes down, the proletariat is no longer satisfied. And here's what will happen: it will turn to the universal churches. And the universal churches are a product of empire. They're not possible without empire, right? So there would be no Christianity without Paul being able to travel around the whole empire, because the Pax Romana. And the same argument would be for Buddhism in China, and so he would argue that at the end time of a civilization, people turn to a world religion, which becomes the seed of a new civilization. So that would, for him, explain the end of Rome and towards Christianity. But also he gives similar arguments and examples in other civilizational spheres.
You've also got this list of scholars who am I correct to categorize these as all reactions to Spengler? And if
Yeah.
so, you
Yeah,
know,
it's weird. It's weird, but the Spengler was like a nuclear bomb. Like he,
right.
yeah,
So
maybe no longer.
what groups all of these
Yeah.
intellectuals
So let me
as a
see.
distinguished
So
from Spengler?
yeah. So okay, Campbell is known for his, his heroic journey things, right? He's very famous for that. But he also has a 4-volume history of mythology, which connects him to Neumann. And Neumann has a book, The Evolution of Consciousness. And so basically the way they look at mythology is as an expression of the complexity of the human mind, right? So you can look at the like hunter-gathering mythology is different from agrarian mythology, is different from how we look at it in the industrial society, is different in how we would look at it in a cognitive society. So the Campbell, I read just the first volume. It's very, very interesting analysis of hunter-gathering, religion and spirituality, and what that says about our psyche. So he's kind of Jungian, right? Neumann has done the same. Very interesting books if you're interested in that aspect. And so this is, I would call them the integral tradition as well, because there is a way that outside of historical material and historical idealism, you have few people who put them together, right? So that kind of method, what you have is there is a material reality, the modes of production, the climate, the geography. There is ways that society organizes to cope with the possibilities and challenges of that physical reality. But the way it does that is dependent on their frames of consciousness. So the level of complexity that at a certain time a human consciousness is capable of envisaging. So that would be what these people bring to the table. And it's called integrative, integral.
Let's
I personally
let
was very influenced by Ken Wilber in my
yeah,
30s.
we will talk about him
Yeah.
as well. But let's, because there's so many different thinkers here. Let's isolate what I think from my reading two of the biggest in this lineage, which is Campbell and Gebser, and sort of zero in on their two aspects here. I mean, my first question would be, if Spengler's got this superorganismic view, how does that, and seasonal view, how does that intersect, or how does that differ from Campbell with what seems to be a real emphasis on mythological evolution, but also a kind of teleological, chronological view in the way he's articulating a kind of evolution of mythology?
Yeah.
And what does that mean for where we are today?
Well, I'll give you just an example what I remember from Campbell. So he would say, for example, at a certain level, of matriarchal societies, you have mythologies where the man gets eaten by the woman, like Narcissus and those types of mythologies, right? It doesn't end well when a man tries to be independent. It ends badly. And this reflects for Campbell, a certain stage of social organization, which is matriarchal. And look at the ancestors. There's not much innovation. It's static. That's again, I'm not saying this is true. I'm saying this is the way they talk about it, right? Then he would say, if I remember it right, the Jonah and the whale, right, where the man goes in the belly of the whale, but he comes out of it okay, and he even has a girlfriend when he comes out, right? That's for him is a symbolic shift toward like a patriarchal form of society. Now the man has a place. Before he didn't have a place. He's subordinate. Now he has a place and might even become dominant. And that's how Campbell and Neumann look at mythology. Is they tease out of these stories and how they change over time, that they represent new possibilities of the human ego and the human mind. And that then also allows you to look differently at society and what is possible in society. That's where Wilber comes in, and Gebser comes in, right? So Gebser would have archaic,
You got it there. Archaic, magical, mythical, mental,
mythological,
integral, irrational.
rational, and integral.
Yeah.
And okay, here I'm bringing in Wilber, who formalized a lot of this as well. You know, he would say
it seems like a similar basic structure to what Wilber talks about, and of course, people are much more familiar with Wilber than Gebser. But you're saying structurally they're very similar.
Yeah, because what they bring into the analysis is that the way we look at the world co-creates the world. And so if we change the level of consciousness, the level of complexity that we can behold in our consciousness, we can look at the world differently. And you know, this is not.
Would Spengler say this is just nonsense?
Yeah, he would say that's just nonsense. Yeah. But you know, so for example, there's something called the index of cultural complexity. And you know, they read the Bible, for example, and they can tell you how each part of the Bible is written by a different level of consciousness, and over time, that consciousness goes up, right? So you can find passages where, you know, kill them all, and that represents a certain type of consciousness. And then there's, you know, other passages, change swords into plowshares. It's not the same consciousness. It's not just a difference in opinion. You know, for example, they would claim that fascism and Stalinism, even though they're very different opinions, have very similar mental structures. Right? You can agree or disagree with that, but that's what they.
Well, I think Stalinism is a form of National Socialism.
You said it. But anyway, that's that would be the argument, that even though they're politically different, they operate in the same. And similarly, if you discuss state versus market, right? This is the civilizational scheme. You're thinking within the civilizational scheme. But what if we're now beyond the civilizational scheme? So the civilizational scheme would be three things. Would be a particular relation to nature. And Toynbee would argue civilization is born to survive a natural challenge. So, for example, if we want to stay in Egypt, we need to dominate the water. In order to dominate the water, we need to reorganize ourselves. Right? Otherwise, you go away. But if you want to stay there, you need to dominate the water.
And so how do you, like, this is, I know we're just giving a systematic overview of all of these different perspectives and approaches, but do you have a way of creating a theoretical relationship between, let's say, the superorganismic approach and, let's say, the stages of consciousness approach? Because they seem quite antithetical.
No,
like for example,
so, okay, this gets complex, right? But this goes to the heart of my own approach, which is, you know, cosmo-localism, right? So, you know, you have, okay, so the people, let's say the globalists, and they, you know, they wanted some global infrastructure, global mentality, you know, mass migration, cultural
globalists,
cultural mixing everywhere. And there's good to that, there's bad. You know, the bad to it is that everything looks the same. You go to Kigali and Chiang Mai, and you'll find exactly the same buildings and exactly the same coffee shops, right? So it's particular way of envisaging, some kind of globalization. There's others, but that's like a powerful one. The the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians no longer agree with this, right? But they're still within the state form. They say, let's go back to the United Nations in 1945, but without the hegemony of the West. And let's transform our own nation states into civilization states. So in order to keep stability, because we don't want to become like the West, and the West is going down. This is how they're thinking. So we need to go back to our, some kind of synthesis between civilization and Western modernity. That's what they're trying to do. For example, in China, it's very interesting. So they want to merge some form of Marxism, Maoism, Dengism, Jinpingism with, they have Confucian institutes everywhere in every city with 40,000 people. But they're also translating in a year and a half 300 conservative European authors, right? Mm-hmm. Because one of the, sorry, I forgot his name. Maybe it's Wang Hui. This is like the Dugin of China. So this is a guy who lived in the West, came back, became friends with Xi Jinping, and said, like, we got to stop this wokeism in China because
just for clarification, this is like the neo-sovereigntists, like the Dugins.
Yeah, and they are neo-sovereignists.
Yeah,
and they want to use the state to maintain stability.
Yeah.
But it's no longer just a modern state because they inject into the state a civilizational identity, right?
Yeah.
That's something very difficult to understand in the West. When I see how people talk about Putin, they think he's like crazy or reactionary or.
But a lot of the movements in the UK are drawing on that ethos. They're drawing on that energy.
Yeah, but that's why people don't understand why does Trump love Putin, right? Because at one level there is ideological sympathy, which is the restoration of the nation state. So there is a level of sympathy between the neo-populists in the West and what they see happening in these countries. They like what they see, right? They may not agree with everything, but they think,
they think that's a way forward.
It's a way forward, right? Oh. So it's complicated because there are mixes of many things, but there's definitely something happening, that creates a level of sympathy between what is happening in Russia and Hungary and what the neo-populists want to do in the West. And it's using the state to save their national cultures.
Yeah. I mean, whether or not it'll work, it's just important to recognize that there's a lot of energy behind this idea at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and especially if this is where we are, who am I to say this, but, if we don't have a third option, these are the two only options available. Right.
So that's important, I think, and we make that perhaps a theme throughout the month, that we are trying to embed these ideas about the commons in contemporary political zeitgeist, and how do we actually work a third way.
So I wrote this article called the geopolitics of cosmo-localism.
Okay.
And so I used three images: the planetary Leviathan, which is basically the WEF, which is multi-stakeholder governance with global finance, weak nation states, and approved NGOs. But without the people.
Global capitalism.
Yeah, but without the people, right? So national sovereignty is gone. There's no people. There's no sovereign people anymore.
Yeah, I think it's global capitalism versus a new weird form of state fascism, and then there's potentially a third option, which is the commons.
Yeah, and what's that? So that would be all the people doing regenerative work at the local level because we need to, because there's a heightened risk, and so at some point we really need to know where the food comes from, where the energy comes from, etc., etc. And we need, if we want to live where we are, we need to regenerate our territories and make sure we're healthy soil, etc., etc. So that is happening. And so this is something I call the archipelago of regenerative villages. So that's the third option. And so what that option means is that we now have technology and capital that we can use cosmo-locally without passing to the nation state. We can, but we don't have to, right? So if we succeed in coordinating and putting together like a whole series of regenerative projects, give it a digital identity, give it the capacity to attract commons compatible capital, right? Then we can say, okay, maybe we'll negotiate with our territorial overlords, but maybe not. We can also decide to unite permaculture communities as permaculture communities. And we can have guilds that unite permaculture communities. You see what I mean? So it becomes like a, I'm not saying it's hegemonic, but it becomes a realistic partial reaction to what is happening today in terms of crisis, right? And especially to the degree that you don't like what you see. Let's say you don't like national populism, right? That's one more reason to say, well, this is not the kind of country I want from, but we can preserve our values and organize with other people elsewhere. And that's what the churches did, right? So yeah, so this is my favorite author, actually. Cogin Karatani. So he has a book called The Structure of World History, and he distinguishes 4 different modalities. So let me first maybe introduce Alan Page Fisk, Structures of Social Life. According to Alan Page Fisk, there's only 4 ways to deal with value that have existed everywhere in the world at all times, but in different combinations. So one is communal shareholding. Communal shareholding is exchanging with the whole. Like when an Amish family marries, the whole community will co-build the house. It's called barn raising. That young couple doesn't owe anybody individually anything, but they owe to do the same when the next couple marries, and they will also build their house, right? So you're exchanging with the whole. When a free software developer writes a free software batch, he gives it to Linux or whatever. Nobody individually owes him anything back, right? You do it because give a brick, get a house. So that's communal shareholding, the first ever mode of exchange in human history. The hunter or the gatherer comes back. It's for the family. It's not sold. It's for the family, and there's some kind of mechanism to share it. So that was dominant in the nomadic band period. Once you start settling, this is what Alan Page Fisk calls equality matching. Equality matching is now you need to make the peace. You need to avoid war because you can't flee. You have a settled village. So you start gifting to create good feelings, but the gifting creates a debt. If you give me something, I'm now inferior to you.
I want people to recognize that gifting also has a violence to it.
Oh yeah. Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. That's the dark side of gifting. It's the same thing. Same thing, right?
There's also a power in gifting. Like if I can give a big gift.
Yeah. That's the potlatch, right? The potlatch in North America is, every year, one chief tries to overdo the other chief, and you get more prestige through gifting, and it could get very bad. It could really destroy even the tribe in question. So there's a dark side to this. No, this is not an utopian vision. This is just explaining a value logic, right? So the value logic of gifting, equality, matching. Once you have invasion and domination and conquest, that no longer works. I'm not going to give to my exploiter. But now what happens is I'm going to protect you against other invaders, keep the peace, but you have to give me time and money so that I can do this, right? So that's the protection system of the state, and that creates, if it works, creates a market and market pricing. So those are 4 different forms of value exchange that have existed throughout history in different combinations, but Karatani historicizes them. So first, he calls it mode A, gifting and commoning in tribal kinship-based organizations. Mode B, the state. And mode C, the market. Now, his thesis I find very interesting is that we are genetically primed to live in mode A. We want to live in mode A. We want to live with people that we know, that we trust. We want to live convivially. And civilization alienates us from that conviviality. So then he introduces something called mode D. Mode D is the permanent attempt by humanity to recreate mode A at a higher level of complexity, right? And let me briefly introduce Hansi Freinacht, who is not in your slides.
No.
Who distinguishes, I'm trying to remember the language, a new productive system and a purification engine, purification generator, and anyway, let's focus on the first, a new regime of extraction. That is always very hard. It's exploitative. It creates surplus value, creates a ruling class, etc. Over time, that becomes unacceptable to the majority of the people, and you have a counter pressure, and that's the purification generator. So the agricultural revolution is the extraction engine, but the axial religions are the purification generator for the agricultural productive engine. I hope you're still following me.
Yeah.
And so that you can also historicize. So for Karatani, the axial religions are the first mode D, right? They're a mode D reaction to the agricultural form of civilization. And they ethicize the agricultural empires. They create a level of abstraction to think about right behavior. And you need justice and you need different things. Otherwise, urban living is impossible.
Right.
And that's totally compatible with Spengler and Toynbee and all of that. They would agree with this. But then, and this is a very important historical change. So if you look at time, first we have cyclical time, but the Christians and the Zoroastrians introduce linear time, right? You have a beginning, you have a creation, and you have an apocalypse. So now there's a direction in time, but there's no betterment, right? There's no betterment. The apocalypse, after the apocalypse, there is something, evil is, but the actual life of the people does not improve over time. It actually gets worse, right? And this is changed with Joachim de Fiore, a Franciscan monk, I think in the 12th century, who says there was the age of the Father, the age of the Son, and the age of the Spirit. The age of the Father is the Old Testament based on obedience and fear.
Right.
The age of the Son, the age of love and the church. And the age of the Spirit is the age of brotherhood, where we don't actually need the church and everybody will live like the monks in peace. So this is what Eric Voegelin calls the immanentization of the Eschaton, right? So the belief in transcendence is horizontalized, and now we believe in the future. So mode D, after that, becomes secular,
which is basically Marxist in structure, and that's the thing that interests me in Karatani. Obviously, he's making a direct reference saying from modes of production to modes of exchange, but the basic structure of the A, B, C, D, it reminds me of the structure in Marxism with the primitive communism and the world communism, where we try to recreate world communism at the higher level. And the reason why we try to recreate world communism at the higher level is
The
because
same, and we
the
can't
same,
abandon it. We can't abandon it because
right?
we're primed to believe that the world can be better than it is, and that will never disappear. But
Yeah.
the form can.
Gnostics be damned.
Yeah, yeah, and that's why they were defeated, right?
So
Anyway,
how does that fit in that this idea of world systems analysis? Does it relate in a meaningful way?
well, what can I say about it's
You say
so
it's a materialist response here.
yeah. So I mean, it's a very complex series of thinkers, but let me see what I can say that is. Um, so I just read Andre Gunder Frank, Reorient, which I think is a bit of an outlier, but still very interesting, and he fits completely in this thinking. So what they are doing is his thesis is the whole is more important than the parts, right? So there has always been a world economy and a world system, and so you cannot explain anything by stressing the role of Europe, for example. So they would look and say that until the 18th century, China was the dominant economy in the world, and it's only for really special conjunctural reasons where basically Asia had problems and Europe had particular situation where gold was coming in, that it allowed them to get in the system. But so unlike the first wave, most of these people are deterministic. They look at economic flows and infrastructure and military technology to explain world history. And I haven't been a Marxist for many years before. I fully appreciate with this way of looking at the world. But the way I think about it today is that we need this integrative perspective, right? That we need to basically hold historical materialism as a particular view that illuminates a lot of reality by showing I'll give you an example. This is Philip Bobbitt, The Shield of Achilles, which is a history of warfare and nations. And the way that he explains the Renaissance in Italy is very simple. So there is an invention of the cannon and a particular weapon with spikes, a long gun with spikes. And now two things happen. Now you can destroy fortresses and city walls. And you can have standing armies with only the monarchies can afford, right? So here is a very clear instance in which the idea of individual city-states is just inoperable, not because bright ideas of anybody, but because the material situation makes it impossible to maintain city-states in this new world and this new technoculture logic. So I find this very, very interesting. And another aspect would be the role of technology and communications, right? So, and this actually brings already to the third school, but so the idea, and Cadel, I
What's
know
the third school?
so the third school is like complexity historians, the big history, right?
Yeah.
Basic idea is you have matter and energy, and this is from your book, from your thesis, your PhD, Cadel. You have matter and energy, but the way they express themselves and can be bound depends on information technology, right? So without writing, you can only have hunter-gathering. once you have writing, you can have agriculture and cities and mining and bronze and all that stuff. Once you have print, you can have industry. Once you have the internet, you can have translocal organizations. So this is the kind of stuff you would find in the second school. Can we go back to the first school just to see if I missed anything?
Of
And then
the world systems.
yeah. Where before you went to Karatani, we
Yeah,
were
I thought with the world systems
okay.
actually, like, of all these different thinkers, I think the one that I'm most familiar with, the one that probably people need, that I think is most relevant in contemporary times, is Peter Turchin.
Yeah,
And he comes up a lot. I think we could tie that in with the conversation because emphasizing these cycles, this cyclical pattern, it kind of it fits in quite well with the Spenglerian model, I would say.
yeah. So maybe just to come back to time, right? So we have um, kind of before the cycles, um, like an eternal present, an eternal past, and ancestors. And you look at the ancestors, and you have rituals which repeat. Basically, like a long lasting cultural form. The specifically cyclical ideas, I think I'm not sure, but I think they come from Zoroaster. And then you have the linear vision, right? And then the progress thinking, which comes after Joachim de Fiore. And time becomes important, right? So from that moment on, there's a study of cycles, and so just
So
to give
where Spengler emphasizes the organismic, I guess someone like Turchin would emphasize almost like the physics or the thermodynamics of these processes.
yeah, yes, okay. I did read Turchin. I don't remember the detailed argumentation, but it's
He generates these mathematical models that
yeah,
describe
but it's
these rise
so
and fall.
you have a nation or an empire, and it consolidates, and then it creates a ruling class, and the ruling class will basically augment its needs. It works first, and so that creates overpopulation, and then you always reach a limit where it can no longer basically thermodynamically support that level, and then it goes down. So that's kind of like
I
a,
guess that
a
I guess for
2,000-year cycle of civilization,
yeah.
of a particular empire, let's put it. So there's difference between civilization, and within a civilization you can have different empires. For example, in China, there's like a 300-year cycle of civilization, followed by somewhat shorter, but also 1, 2, 3 centuries long disintegration process. Right, in China, it's very visible that you have these. I think they had it 7 times, so 7 times, and then 7 disintegration. So this is the kind of thing that Turchin would look around, and it would look at the overproduction of elites, and he would argue that we are now in an overproduction of elites, and that creates revolution. So just to, should I say about cycles?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, okay, so the civilization cycle of 1,000 years. Generative cycle is 50 years or 60 years, right? Up and down economically. Each time you have a particular combination of energy, management styles, agriculture, communication technology, that creates like an upside wind, and then it will reach a peak and go down, and so on and so on. The secular cycle is 100 years and is a civic cycle. So that's about new institutions. So think about World War II. And this is from Strauss-Ho and Neil Howe, to verify the book titles. But anyway, it's a very famous book, The Fourth Turning. So the first turning is the institution, the new institutions, and everybody agrees with them. It's kind of the golden age. The children of this successful generation will have a spiritual awakening and will question their parents. So this is 68. The reaction to the 50s, 68. So that's the second turning, spiritual awakenings. The third turning, he calls it the unraveling. This is when the two forces are at equal strength. So you have the old generation is getting older, slowly retiring, and you have the younger generation slowly going into the institutions and becoming managers, at ever higher levels. So that's when the two worlds collide. So this would be the 90s and the 80s and the 90s, the early political correctness crisis and the 90s. The fourth turning is the crisis. So if you believe the fourth turning, 25, 29 is the end, the absolute end of the 100-year secular cycle. And the new civic cycle will start already in the 2030. So how can you imagine this? Would be, national populists winning and undoing the boomer culture and basically reordering society. It could happen, might happen. So that would be like a way to imagine this, right? It wouldn't solve everything, but it would create a new set of civic institutions. And you can look at Poland and Hungary as examples of what had already happened, basically.
Right, right. Yeah, I've noticed that. I
Yeah,
think
so
the only thing I
would
want to
be-
say before moving on to the final sort of categories, and then we'll open it up for collective reflection. But I just want to say that if, again, the Spenglerian group was more superorganismic, and then the reaction to Spengler was more culturalistic or idealistic,
yeah,
forming on the mind.
yeah.
I think the world systems analysis it tends to be more systematic. It tends to be more mathematical. There's a lot of use of complex systems theory. And then that would be a nice bridge, I think, into talking about the big historians and cosmic evolutionary thinkers.
Yeah. So maybe one thing is important in world system analysis is that they reject civilization. I mean, they can occasionally talk about it, but they
Right.
do
They
not.
abstract it away from civilization.
Yeah, and they would have an ideological critique as well.
Mm.
For example, if you look at how Western analysts critique Putin and the kind of civilization state idea with the return of orthodoxy as a completely evil reactionary, like
Right.
there's no understanding of that, right?
Yeah.
Why are the Chinese organizing Confucian institutes in every city with more than 40,000 people? Like, why would you do that? That's not something that's understandable. At least in like the more simplistic understandings of world systems. It would be about classes, it would be about forces, it will be, and of course, yeah, as you say, Brodel would look at the prices of grain and the prices of oil and and develop these very long time scales and the long durée.
So I think we should cover just very quickly the cosmos and maybe specifically just Pierre Teilhard de Chardin very quickly. I think that's probably the most important thinker of the cosmos that you list,
Yeah.
and then we'll go on from there.
I think de Chardin and Aurobindo in different cultural spheres and different spiritual spheres, but they have the same goal, which is to bring evolution in religious thinking.
Yeah.
and to bring religious thinking into science. To, they attempt some kind of
Yeah, they want
integration.
to they want to bring together religion and science.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, I would say the Chardin, because and then I can come back to Soriano because he's basically, saying the same. So the idea of the resurrection of the body and the sacralization of matter, right? So, like, when St. Paul talks about resurrection, he's not talking about zombies coming back, right? It's fully human spiritual beings with a body, and the body and the body and the spirit are totally integrated. And I guess Thierry de Chardin kind of applies this to cultural evolution, where you have a material evolution, but it creates a noosphere, and the noosphere then also evolves and can then kind of merge and converge with matter. And if you look at transhumanism, right, that's very much a mix of the same. There's a guy called Frank Tipler, The Physics of Immortality.
Yeah, there are Christian transhumanists.
Yeah, yeah. And so, okay, Frank Tipler would argue that, okay, first we invent computers, then we invent computers that can create other computers. We create robots. We create smart robots. And we send smart robots to space to green the universe and to make the universe conscious. And that eventually leads to a world computer that at the end of the Big Bang will have so much energy that will be able to recreate all life that ever existed. Right? So, in a very weird way, from a kind of mathematical and astrophysical perspective, he says, "Oh, Christianity was right,
Right.
because we will have a resurrection of the body, but we can explain it scientifically."
Right. So we just want to understand that some of the ideas in the 21st century that try to infuse Christianity into evolutionary thought have its origins really and maybe are indebted to the work of Chardin.
Yeah, except I would think that the level of complexity and maturity of the Chardin doesn't, it's like high and low, culture, right? There's like a lot of transhumanist thinking is very simplistic.
I agree.
They will say, "Oh, we just download consciousness, we copy every neuron, and we have done." So there's no sense that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
we have intelligence in the stomach, in the heart, that it's out there in relationships. It's kind of a mechanistic view, and I don't think Chardin can be accused of that.
No, 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 no.
And so he knows Christianity inside out and high theology. And I would say, even though, of course, he was critiqued by the church, right? The church does
Yeah,
not
the
accept
Catholic
him.
Church did not. The Catholic Church did not
They still
support Chardin.
don't. They still don't. A lot of Catholics do, but the church doesn't. And same with Aurobindo. I'm reading Aurobindo, and I find him quite complex. I'm reading the Divine Life, and I think it's brilliant in the way that he interprets and explains all the Hindu concepts, but then makes them compatible and complementary to science, right? So again, this is why I like integrative thinking, integral thinkers, because you can hold both, in your two hands. And there's Lauren Goldner. I don't know if you know him, Cadell, but he's a very interesting Marxist, and he distinguishes the warm tradition and the cold tradition of thinking.
Yeah,
So
you told me about this.
the Renaissance is still integrative. Like all these thinkers, they have theories of consciousness, theories of matter, and they kind of mix them together. They do alchemy and hermetics, like 80% of the work of Newton was alchemy, and only 20% was what we know from him, right? So it's the Enlightenment for Goldner that breaks that unity of thinking between the immaterial and the material. And then he explains Marxism as warm because it comes from the idealist tradition via Hegel. So it's a warm tradition. But the socialism that dominates comes from the engineers who were the leaders of the socialist parties. And they come from the Enlightenment, which rejected the warm side and focuses on cold materiality and mechanistic functioning. So I think that's an interesting point of view. But this is what, yeah. So what Ken Wilber has done.
I mean, I think you've been infusing integral thought and Ken Wilber's thought throughout the presentation. I mean,
Yeah.
probably most people will be familiar with Wilber anyway.
Then, yeah.
But yeah, is there anything we should cover before?
Well, basically the ability that he had to synthesize psychological evolution from the West and fit together all the big psychologists in a spectrum. And when I was in my 20s, I was very troubled and I just didn't know what to do, right? Do I do psychoanalysis? Do I do Gestalt? Do I do this? Do I do that? And they kind of all say that the others are wrong. And so Wilber, I think his first brilliance was just to say, well, depending on your stage in your psychological evolution, you can benefit from all of them if it's appropriate to your level. So I thought that already was very interesting. And then he continues and he says, well, the East didn't psychologize. They went transmental. And then he also makes compatible the different traditions of the East. And so that's called the spectrum of consciousness. And I think it's still like a brilliant, thing that he did. He was 24. And then he creates a methodology, and I'll be very brief about it, which is look at every phenomena from the subjective and the objective point of view, from the individual and the collective point of view. So subjective individual, evolution of the psyche, subjective objective individual, the evolution of the body and technology as an expression of the body, collective subjectivity, so culture and collective objectivity systems, right? And so what I find interesting with that is that you can always like just go around, and so not decide where's the chicken and the egg, but just say, okay, how is that? So if you want to look at the internet, it's like, okay, it's a technology, it's a system of organization, it creates a culture and it changes the psyche, and it's all of those things at the same time. And so how do you create, for example, if you want to change anything, how do you create positive feedback loops between those and elements in the four quadrants, right? I think this is still, there's a lot of critique that you can give on all the people I mentioned. And Wilber has particularly been critiqued because he simplifies his synthesis. So he will say Jungians, agree on this and this and this, but then you talk to Jungians and they say, no, we don't agree on this. So that's the problem with Wilber. And so I rejected Wilber at some point in my life. It was like killing the father. It was my last guru, if you like, because I thought I have to read these people myself. I cannot trust Wilber's interpretations. But it doesn't mean that he's not useful.
Well, you can reconcile and pay some homage to the father today.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's very good. I guess the big historians are worth saying something about. We did mention them briefly. You mentioned I've done some of my work in this field, and I think if we were to just summarize this very briefly, it's bringing together physical, biological, and cultural evolution into one sort of frame of reference. And I guess the big question I've always had with big history and cosmic history as it relates to the topics of our month is this adding anything to our understanding? Like, would Spengler or any of the other macro historians read the big history and the cosmic history and gain new insight from it, or
I
is
think
it?
it does. I think it
Yeah.
does to some degree because, things like bifurcation, right?
Mm.
So the integration of linearity um, and cycles and bifurcations, you can recognize that, right? And then can I briefly give you my own interpretation of this? This
Yeah,
is how
go
you
for it.
get a social change, right? So you have a paradigm that solved a number of issues, successful social system, and then it stops functioning optimally. It creates its own problems, and it cannot solve the problems it creates with its own logic because they're the result of its own logic, right? So you have a disintegration of the paradigm, a loss of integration. So that creates fragmentation and polarization. Fragmentation because there's no longer a common story. We don't believe the press. We don't believe science. We lose confidence. So everybody has its own view. And there's no more arbitrage between the views. So we can't make sense. So there's the atomization going on. The paradoxical result of atomization is polarization. Because now I'm alone. Who can I count on? Right? Very, very difficult. I spoke about my cancellation to you, Cadell, in our preliminary conversation. And that's so everybody that around you turns against you. Say, oh wow, I thought I could count on these people, but I can't.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, you are a white guy.
Yeah, I'm a white guy, so I'm at the top of the oppression pyramid. But so the thing is, at that moment, like you really start thinking differently. Like, oh wow, from now on, I have to know people that I can count on. That's a big shift in my life, right? Like a shift from commenting to reciprocity, in a way. It's not that I don't do any commenting, but I'm just more careful. So when this applies globally, you have tribalization, right? You have only 4% of Democrats marry Republicans, right? So we have replaced racism. Only 10% of white people don't want their children to marry somebody from another race. But we have replaced it with political racism. That's now the tribes, and it's tearing the West apart, right? So fragmentation, polarization. So then I talk about exit. The first wave of exit is people with anticipatory consciousness. The system is no longer working. I see it already. Apparently, in other people are not seeing that clearly, but I already see it. I can't stay here. I have to find another way. So these people tend to leave the logic of the old system and start experimenting with what they believe is the answer. And they create new things. They go back to the countryside. New realization, all kinds of stuff are happening. People are leaving and trying to do it in a different way. So over time, these things consolidate and come together, right? They form subsystems. So by that time, when the old system is further and further disintegrating, now you have a second wave of exit, massive exit, because they have to. Like there's no more jobs. Rome went from 1 million to 80,000 people. Where do you go? You go to the people who have successfully created alternatives which represent a new logic of the future, right? So the monasteries by that time exist, are consolidated, and can get people around the monasteries that will become, the farmers and will have a relationship with the monastery. So that's like that's the feudal order has been created out of the ashes of the Roman Empire over quite some time, but there are periods of acceleration.
I guess it's just, what does the study of cosmic evolution and biological evolution add to that?
Well, that there are bifurcation, there are qualitative changes,
Hmm.
there are new paradigms, and you find them. For example, one thing I remember is, so you have a certain unit in a system, and they start fighting each other.
Yeah. So there are patterns. There
Yeah,
are
right.
patterns throughout nature that you can sort of articulate a narrative that expresses continuity with nature,
Yeah,
uh, perhaps on a deeper level than, and maybe you start to recognize patterns that maybe you can't recognize if you're only focusing on human history,
yeah,
something like that.
yeah.
So I
And
think that's a good enough overview. Is there anything you'd want to say about the controversy? Because this is the last slide, and then we'll have some time for reflections or questions for Michel. And
yeah,
is there
so,
anything you think we should really emphasize here, or
no, well, Tainter is maybe an early example of these complexity thinkers, right? Because he looks purely at the formal evolution of an empire as expanding, arriving at a point where the cost of expansion is more than the benefit of expansion, so it stagnates. Because it can no longer get surplus, it starts declining and it collapses. So
and then
that's
and then
that's cybernetic thinking, basically.
and then Jared Diamond also is probably most people know. He had a very popular book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and then he's also studied environmental collapse. So is it controversial because he's studying fundamental collapse of civilization, or what's controversial about?
Well,
Is it
I
the environmental approach?
I read Diamond, and to be honest, I read it and I couldn't make sense of it. So
Okay.
I felt that after
I
I
know
read
it's
it,
being criticized as a kind of environmental determinism.
yeah, a geographical determinism, right? His basic thesis is that, so we have Eurasia,
Yeah,
and Eurasia you can easily travel from east to west.
yeah,
So innovations, it takes some time, but they travel. But north south, for example, Africa is
yeah.
cut by
Sahara.
the tropical forest, and so they couldn't develop. And so by the time that the rest Eurasia is highly developed, they can just basically destroy Africa because they're not at the same level. And the same with North and South America, where they have these big geographical obstacles. So they also have like a huge delay in development. They don't have the wheel. They don't have, right. And so they create, and so that is the explanation why they collapsed and with the West so easily. So that's a determinism. But his book Collapse, I cannot find like an easy explanation why some countries make it and others not. I find it, in a way, I don't find it systematic enough. I That's my problem with Diamond. Probably not everybody is agrees with that. Coker, to be honest, I don't remember. And Huntington, of course, that's a big issue, right? Whether civilizations exist, but also like if they exist, whether they are um, designed to fight each other. And I'm just reading now Felic Konecki on the plurality of civilization. He's a Polish macrohistorian. I find him very interesting. And he says the same. Civilizations they're not compatible with each other because they have family law, property law, inheritance law, sense of beauty, justice. Like you can't mix them. They have an internal coherence. So if you bring, and of course that would be very controversial, because that's what the populist thinks, right? If you bring too much Islam in the West, like it can't last. One has to win and the other has to lose. So obviously that's very controversial.
Uh,
But then,
Zero sum.
yeah, then the question that becomes complicated then for me is, and I live in Thailand and I work with Chinese people and everything. I'm kind of immersed in a non-European culture. And I see both, right? I see an enormous amount of Westernization, and I do think there is a global civilization in a certain sense, in the sense that they all have nation states, they all have capitalism, they all have states, they all have markets that have adapted to the Western way, not just, I mean, so there's differences, but there's a fundamental, there's also similarity. And
The
and then I
greatest
also,
similarity is that we're all in global capitalism.
yeah. And then I also understand, and I'm married to a Thai wife, and I'm every day I'm surprised, even after 20 years, that we feel so differently about things that come from very deep cultural, values, right? So I don't know exactly how to think about this. Do we still have different civilizations?
Right.
Obviously there's differences, but there's also, like a huge amount of integration has happened, right? So, and I travel a lot on our list now, but you know, over time, everything starts looking the same.
Mhm.
I go in the mountains in Ecuador. I was there for 6 months, and there's cyber cafes and there's coffee shops, and they look the same as they do in Chiang Mai. Like, there's a kind of architecture that is, with glass, the way they use glass, and prefab stuff. It's
There's a way in which capitalism is taking everything up into itself,
Yeah, yeah.
and I think that there's definitely a
So, the
deep
civilization
reality to
state, right?
that.
We should discuss the civilization state, where that's a realistic option. But definitely, the Chinese, the Indians, the Russians, they think like this. They think we need to reconnect with our own civilization's value. The West is completely corrupt and decadent. We don't want to go there. So, we need to de-Westernize now, right? That is a very strong feeling.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that's I mean a pretty general overview of the macro historians, and we should have some time for questions and reflections. So if anyone wants to, yeah, raise your hand if you want to ask a question or share a reflection or just have an idea inspired by the presentation, and let's do this. The video you just watched is part of a larger lecture hosted in the portal with Michel Bauwens for a course dedicated to the commons, peer-to-peer, and civilizational transition. To see the full video, you can sign up using the link below to get lifetime access to the commons course. You can also get access to the video by becoming a member of the portal. Members of the portal are the core of Philosophy Portal and get access to our entire recorded history. We also host 4 live events every month. To learn more or to sign up, check the link below, and I hope to see you at a future event.